Dublin's streets were cold that evening, but the sound of music gave them warmth. Under the glow of a flickering streetlight stood Rico Dela Cruz, a young Filipino man with a second-hand guitar and a voice that could stop anyone in their tracks. He wasn't a local celebrity or a social media star. He was simply a dreamer, a street performer who sang from his heart. Each note that left his lips carried the memory of his late father, who used to sing Elvis songs back in Manila. Rico grew up listening to those old vinyl records, learning every word and every emotion. Now, miles away from home, he sang not for fame but for connection. His rendition of "Can't Help Falling in Love" floated through the Dublin air like a timeless echo. Passers-by slowed their steps, some even stopped completely, their expressions softening as his soulful tone reached them. His voice had that rare sincerity that made strangers feel like they knew him. Coins clinked into his open guitar case, but Rico barely noticed. For him, the music was more than a means of survival. It was his language, his faith, and his therapy. An elderly Irish man dropped a few euros and said, "You sing better than Elvis, lad." Rico laughed shyly, thinking it was just a kind comment. He didn't realize those same words would soon define him. Later that night, as the crowd thinned, a tourist filmed him with a phone. Rico smiled and nodded, grateful that someone cared enough to record. He didn't even ask why. The next morning, while he was brewing instant coffee in his tiny rented room, his phone buzzed uncontrollably. Notifications flooded in. The video had gone viral overnight. Millions of views, thousands of comments. People from around the world wrote things like, "He sounds even more emotional than Elvis himself," and "This guy deserves to be on a big stage." Rico sat there in shock, his hands trembling. He couldn't afford new shoes, yet the world was calling him a superstar. For the first time, he felt his father's dream coming alive again. 2 weeks later, Rico found himself standing inside the Ireland's Got Talent studio. He had applied online after dozens of fans begged him to audition. It was surreal, bright lights, cameras, an audience that stretched into the dark. He had never seen anything like it. When his name was called, his heart pounded against his chest like a drum. The massive stage looked like another universe compared to his street corner. Simon Cowell sat among the judges, his expression calm but unreadable. Rico took a deep breath and introduced himself softly, his accent carrying both humility and hope. "I'm from the Philippines, but Ireland has been my second home. I'm going to sing an Elvis song." The audience murmured, a few chuckles echoing through the crowd. They'd seen many Elvis impersonators before. But when Rico strummed the first chord and began to sing, "Suspicious Minds," the laughter disappeared. His voice filled the hall with a richness that made people forget where they were. It wasn't an imitation, it was a rebirth. His tone carried heartbreak, strength, and gratitude all at once. By the second verse, people were clapping in rhythm. By the final chorus, the entire audience was standing. Simon leaned forward, visibly stunned, his arms crossed in disbelief. When the song ended, the applause felt endless. Simon finally spoke, shaking his head slightly. "That wasn't a performance, that was reincarnation." The other judges smiled, nodding in agreement. One said, "You didn't copy Elvis. You became him." Rico's eyes welled with tears as he whispered a quiet, "Thank you." The host invited him to take a bow. Under those bright stage lights, Rico felt something he hadn't in years: belonging. He thought of his father, watching from above, proud and smiling. That night, as he walked off stage, he realized his life had changed forever. The boy who once sang for coins on a Dublin street was now singing for the world. When the audition aired, Rico's life flipped overnight. The video of his performance racked up millions of views within hours, shared across every social platform with captions like, "The Filipino who sings better than Elvis," and "Simon Cowell was speechless." For Rico, it felt surreal. He was still that same quiet man living in a rented apartment, making coffee in a chipped mug and humming to himself. But now, strangers recognized him on the street. Fans asked for photos, shop owners offered him free meals, and kids shouted, "Hey, Elvis guy." Wherever he went. Yet despite the attention, Rico stayed grounded. He spent his evenings rehearsing in the same alley where it all began, focusing on what mattered most, his voice and his promise to his late father. When he got the call confirming he had made it to the next round, he simply smiled, whispered a prayer, and thanked God for the miracle. The next performance would be crucial. He knew expectations were sky high. People weren't just waiting to see him sing, they wanted to see if he could top his first performance. The night before the show, Rico sat in his tiny room surrounded by photos of his parents. He whispered softly, "This one's for you, Mama." The next evening, he stepped onto the Ireland's Got Talent stage again, dressed in a simple white suit with a red scarf around his neck, a small tribute to Elvis but also his own mother's favorite color. The audience clapped warmly, already familiar with his story. When the music started, Rico sang, "If I Can Dream," one of Elvis's most emotional songs. His voice soared higher and deeper than before, filling the air with raw emotion that silenced the crowd. Every lyric sounded like a prayer, every note like a heartbeat. By the second chorus, people were in tears. The camera panned to the judges, each one visibly moved. Then, halfway through his final verse, Simon Cowell stood up, eyes glistening. In one smooth motion, he slammed the golden buzzer. Golden confetti rained down like a dream, sparkling under the bright lights as Rico froze in shock. The crowd exploded in cheers, chanting his name. Rico dropped to his knees, covering his face, unable to believe what had just happened. Simon walked up on stage and said with a smile, "You didn't just sing an Elvis song, you brought him back to life." Rico tried to speak but words failed him. The audience clapped louder as he whispered, "Thank you, Dad." That moment went viral around the world. News headlines called it one of the most emotional golden buzzer moments ever seen on the show. For days, Rico couldn't leave his house without someone stopping him to say how his voice had touched their hearts. But fame, while beautiful, carried its own weight. By the time the semifinals approached, Rico was exhausted. The pressure of being called the Filipino Elvis began to sink in. He worried people only saw him as an impersonator and not an artist in his own right. During rehearsals, his voice cracked more than usual, and for the first time, he doubted himself. One night, sitting alone in the empty studio, he looked up and whispered, "What if I'm not good enough without Elvis?" His vocal coach placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "Rico, Elvis sang from his soul. So do you. That's your gift, don't lose it." When the semi-final night arrived, the stage felt heavier than ever. The theme lights flashed, the cameras rolled, and Rico stood center stage holding his guitar. He had chosen a risky song, Elvis's, "In the Ghetto," but with his own slow, haunting twist. The arrangement was stripped down, raw, and honest. His voice trembled at first, then grew steadier as he sang about struggle, loss, and hope. The audience listened in complete silence. When he finished, no one moved for a moment. Then came a wave of applause, loud and unending. Simon looked at him and said, "You've proved tonight that you're not a copy of Elvis, you're an artist with your own soul." Rico smiled softly, tears in his eyes, finally feeling free of the shadow he'd carried. That night, he advanced to the finals, not just as the Filipino Elvis, but as Rico Dela Cruz, the man who made the world believe in dreams again. The final night arrived with the kind of electricity that could be felt in the air. The Ireland's Got Talent studio was packed, the crowd louder and more emotional than ever before. All week, Rico had been rehearsing harder than he ever had in his life, perfecting every note, every breath, every movement. He knew this performance wasn't just about winning, it was about honoring everyone who had believed in him, especially his late father and his mother watching from the Philippines. Backstage, Rico stood quietly, clutching a small photo of his parents. "For you," he whispered softly before stepping into the spotlight. The audience roared as his name was announced. The judges smiled warmly, and Simon gave him a small nod that said it all, "You belong here." The music began, gentle and familiar. Rico had chosen "Can't Help Falling in Love," the same song that started everything on the Dublin streets. But this time, it wasn't just him and his guitar. A full orchestra swelled behind him, strings blending beautifully with his voice. His tone was smooth and emotional, every word soaked in sincerity. It wasn't imitation anymore, it was pure Rico. The lights dimmed, leaving a single golden beam shining on him as he sang the final lines. The crowd fell silent, hanging on every note. When he finished, there was a moment of breathless quiet before the entire theater erupted into applause. People stood, shouting his name, waving Philippine flags and Irish banners side by side. Tears streamed down faces in the audience. Simon leaned into his microphone, visibly emotional. Rico, he said slowly, you didn't just honor Elvis tonight, you honored your father, your country, and everyone who's ever had a dream and thought it was impossible. The other judges echoed the praise, calling his performance flawless, divine, and a moment that will never be forgotten. Rico smiled through tears, his heart pounding as he bowed deeply. Then came the results. The lights dimmed, dramatic music played, and the host's voice echoed through the hall. Ireland's Got Talent 2025 champion is, the pause seemed endless. Rico Dela Cruz. The confetti exploded, this time silver and gold. Rico dropped to his knees, overwhelmed with emotion as the crowd's cheers filled the room. Simon stood up, clapping hard, his proud smile saying more than words ever could. The other contestants surrounded him in celebration, and Rico raised his hands toward the ceiling, whispering, "We did it, Dad. We did it." It was more than victory, it was a miracle years in the making. In the weeks that followed, Rico's name was everywhere. Newspapers called him, the Filipino Elvis who conquered Ireland. His winning performance became one of the most watched videos in the world. Invitations poured in, from talk shows in London, music festivals in America, and television specials across Asia. Rico accepted it all with quiet gratitude. He never forgot the streets of Dublin or the people who first dropped coins into his guitar case. During his first major concert tour, he included a segment called Songs from the Street, where he performed the same Elvis classics he once sang to passers-by. Each show was sold out, but Rico always made sure his performances stayed heartfelt and genuine. Months later, he found himself in Los Angeles, headlining a charity concert. The stage was massive, filled with thousands of fans waving both Irish and Filipino flags. For the final number, Rico stepped forward with a microphone in one hand and his mother's hand in the other. The crowd cheered wildly as he smiled through tears. "This song is for my father," he said softly, his voice echoing through the stadium. The orchestra began playing, "Love Me Tender," and Rico sang with every ounce of emotion left in him. His mother watched with pride, tears streaming down her cheeks. The audience joined in, singing along in perfect harmony. The lights dimmed to gold as he reached the last note, holding it beautifully until the music faded. When it ended, the crowd erupted in thunderous applause, chanting his name again and again. Rico bowed deeply, his heart full. He had come from singing on cold Dublin streets to performing for the world, yet he still felt like the same dreamer he'd always been. As he walked off stage that night, he looked up at the sky and smiled. Somewhere out there, his father was watching. Rico Dela Cruz, the boy with a guitar, had become more than a singer, he had become a legend whose voice reminded the world that dreams, no matter how far away they seem, can truly come true.